All right, Dave, it is good to see you, my friend. How have you been?
It is good to see you. Really well, all things considered. It's a very strange year, but none of us has gotten sick. We got a dog. That's very exciting.
Oh yeah.
Yeah, I actually, we moved to Utah 7 years ago. I told my kids, I'm from here, and I grew up backpacking basically. It's kind of my summer recreation. And I said to my kids, we're gonna do a lot of that, and we have done zero because I've been making a living as a corporate trainer, and so I'm never home. And then abruptly this year that changed. So we've been going for the last 2 months every single weekend. We have yet to actually go like an overnight backpacking kind of thing, but 8, 10, 12 mile hikes with the kids and the dog, and that's been great.
Have,
Still trying to figure out how to pay for it because I can do that because corporate training fell apart. But I'm working on that.
It does sound fun, though. So we're going to talk a little bit about world building and how you tie history into that. But for folks who don't know, DJ Butler grew up in swamps, deserts, and mountains. After years of messing around with the practice of law, he finally got serious and turned to his lifelong passion of storytelling. He now writes adventure stories for readers of all ages, plays guitar, and spends as much time as he can with his family, like you say. He's the author of City of the Saints, Rock Band Fights Evil, Space Eldritch, and Crushling from Wordfire Press, as well as the Witchy War series and the Cunning Man series from Bane Books, as well as a new science fantasy adventure in the Palace of Shadow and Joy. You can read more about Dave and his writing at davidjohnbutler.com and follow him on Twitter at davidjohnbutler. Getting to the topic at hand, you deal a lot, you draw a lot from history in a lot of your writing, particularly in the Witchy War series, which I think fans of Ring of Fire would really like. It's set in a sort of a parallel America that's got a lot of magical influence. But you do this cool thing in that series in particular, but in a lot of your work, where you'll pull history apart and put it back together in weird forms. And I thought maybe we'd talk a little bit about that and do some readings. No.
Yeah, absolutely. I should probably say, I think it's probably we probably should stop at inviting people to follow me on Twitter. I think I'm not on Twitter anymore.
Oh, okay. I will. Made
Uh,
you broke free.
yeah, they froze my account. I appealed. They said, "No, you really were bad," and I said, "Well, I'm not coming back." So I think I'm no longer on Twitter. So I should email a new biography. I still did grow up in swamps, deserts, and mountains, though. Um,
Be
yeah,
weird if that part changed. No.
it would be yes, and to his shock. Uh, I had this conversation, my first LibertyCon, with a guy, one of the regulars there, but it's someone whose name I, to my shame, do not remember. Um, and and he said, I started reading Witchy Eye, and I put it down after a couple of chapters because I couldn't figure out what was the turning point, what was the point at which history diverged from Earth history. And I said, well, you're reading it wrong. That's a hairy turtle dove kind of alternate history where we imagine that this key message did not after all get intercepted, and therefore the South won, right? Or whatever we
Yeah,
imagine.
something like that.
Yeah, some important fact went differently, and then we play out how we think the consequences are. That, by the way, is not of course not the kind of alternate history. Ring of Fire readers know that there are other kinds of alternate history too, right? Because Ring of Fire is all about the intrusion of a West Virginia, 20th century West Virginia town into the 17th century Europe, and then of course India and other places. There are other kinds of alternate history. What I like to do is I like to write things that are really Earth adjacent, whatever I write. I do that for various reasons. I think one of the big ones is that a worker in mythology gets a big head start if he uses mythology that he already shares with the audience. And that mythology can be history or geography or popular culture, just as easily as it can be stories of the heroes and the gods, right?
Mm-hmm.
So I like to set stories. I've got a kid series, and my first big press books actually or not from Baen. They're a kid series, and they're set in Victorian England, except it's a Victorian England with a clockwork protagonist. He doesn't know it; he discovers it later. But also trolls and pixies and kobolds and things. And I did that. You know, Victorian England is was a real time and place, but also exists as a mythology in our heads. We think we know things about Victorian England because we watch so many TV shows and movies, and maybe we've read some books, right? And so that gives you space to play around in the heads of your readers with their expectations and building on their knowledge or subverting their knowledge or tricking them, right? Mm-hmm. So the Witchy War in particular, book 4 comes out in November. It's called Serpent Daughter. This is book 1, Witchy Eye in mass market paperback. Does a similar thing with 19th century America, early 19th century America. I would say Jacksonian. We describe the period often as Jacksonian. It's set in the year 1815, actually. But if you said, well, Dave, listen, you must tell me, for me to be able to cognize what you're talking about, you must tell me when the history of this earth diverges from our history, then the answer is somewhere in the garden. It diverges, and yet it is not diverged. It is kind of a funhouse mirror held up to our history and our mythology. Literally our sacred stories, Judeo-Christian sacred stories, and others, to tell a story, to kind of explore the heart of America. So to give you, so that's pompous. So let me be more concrete, okay? So this is set in a. Actually, do I have, you know what I have? This is kind of fun. So at the very beginning, when I was just thinking about writing this story, my son William, I think it was the year after he had second grade homeschool, okay? And so we had purchased this curriculum. The state of Idaho says, look, you can do whatever you want for your kids, but if we come by to audit you, you've got to show that if they're not in public school, they're getting at least as good an education as they would in public school. And so the way most people do this, satisfy this requirement, well, for the most part, they're not audited, so it doesn't matter, right? But what you do is you buy a curriculum and you make your kid work through the curriculum. So, and that came with a bunch of books, but it also came with stuff like this map of the United States. And it's a little bit hidden behind my bookshelf here now. But some of the earliest stuff I did with that, with the story, really involved that map and a dry erase marker. And in fact, the first, like anything else, the first scratches didn't survive. So originally I took this map of the 48 states, and I was writing elves here, dwarven strongholds, and I had a very kind of straight Tolkien traditional fantasy kind of setting in mind, that would nevertheless be, recognizably America. The elves and the dwarves, or especially the dwarves, basically also the elves, went away, but I still have the map hanging on my wall. So the setting is North America. The name America does not appear in any of the books. It is the Empire of the New World east of the Mississippi, and it is organized like an elective. It is an elective empire organized somewhat like the Holy Roman Empire, right? Somewhat, because the Holy Roman Empire is sort of an accidental conglomeration of land holdings of one family and other things that fell into the orbit. This is more deliberate. There is a 1784 Philadelphia Compact, organized under the auspices of the Penn landholder John Penn and the Lightning Bishop Benjamin Franklin. to create an elective empire, right? So they're in this world, they're deliberately modeling it somewhat on the Habsburgs rather than on like the Swiss cantonments or the other, classical Athens or the other examples that our founders were looking at. So there's an elective empire. The electors are a collection of sort of who mattered in the year 1784 in this setting, and so the Penn landholder is one of them. But the Penn lands supply 7 electors, so it's him and 6 others. There are Native American groups. There are Algonquins who send electors. There are Iroquois who send electors. There are clerics, and the Bishop of Boston is an elector, and there are political figures. And so these powers are basically independent, self-governing kingdoms who then send electors to do a limited number of things, including, principally choose the emperor. So story opens 30 years later, 31 years later, in Nashville. And it's the day of the tobacco fair. So I think it's October, early October, late September, Nashville. And Sarah Calhoun is a teenager. She's 15 years old. Sarah's a lot of fun to write. She's smart. She's very active. She's fierce. She's violently loyal, and she's also paranoid and xenophobic and kind of mean. And so she's understood to be the last daughter of the youngest child by some mysterious mistress of the Calhoun elector. So the great the Appalachian people have 13 great families, the so-called ascendancy, and each of them sends one elector. So he's the Calhoun elector, and he's a war hero. And she's his daughter, believed to be his daughter, and she's leading a family young'uns down to the fair to sell her crop. And she becomes the victim of an attempted kidnapping. Who goes to kidnap her? There's a Yankee chaplain he's a Martinite. That is to say, he's a priest after the order of Saint Martin Luther, whose fundamental principle is that the firstborn should not be allowed to hold political power over the children of Eve. Now, what does that mean? I said the divergences in the garden. So there are 2 races of mankind, and the word human, by the way, this is one of these words at the end. I run searches to make sure certain words haven't accidentally crept in, like Pennsylvania if used wrongly, or like America, or like human. So there are 2 races of mankind. To those people in the book who speak with a biblical idiom, which is many of them, they refer to these as the children of Eve and the children of wisdom, and they are all descendants. They're all children of Adam, right? And the understanding, and we have reason by book 2 to see that the understanding is imperfect. And this is, I think, a really interesting and important world building idea, is that people in the real world don't know the facts objectively. We don't agree on the facts. We all know our facts. Some of us are right, some of us are wrong. But it's way too easy to say, in the year X, this happened. In the year Y, that happened. People actually work in narratives. They tell each other stories and songs and ask each other riddles and tell each other jokes that embed partially correct information. So Martin Luther came to prominence when he nailed the skin of the elf heretic Cetes, the firstborn heretic Cetes, who was the mayor of Wittenberg, who dared to exercise authority over the children of Eve to the church door. So he's got this sort of paramilitary order of monk knights who follow him. And this one happens to be the personal, the father confessor, the personal chaplain of Thomas Penn, the emperor, and or his father confessor, and the chaplain of the Philadelphia Blues, the House Light Imperial Dragoons, who are his bodyguard. And he's a Yankee named Ezekiel Angleton, and Ezekiel and his dog's body Obadiah have come to Nashville looking for Sarah, and they try and kidnap her. And then the Blues show up. They arrive and try to help, and other darker creatures start coming after Sarah, because it turns out that she is not, after all, the daughter of Iron Andy Calhoun. She's in fact the hidden child of the dead Empress Mad Hannah Penn, the Emperor Thomas's sister, who was empress before he was, and whom he had immured for madness, and who has just died. And her husband, who's the Curious Eleutherius, who is the king of one of the 7 mound builder kingdoms of the Ohio, king of Cahokia, sort of warrior wizard priest king, a war hero, and legendary figure who died 15 years ago mysteriously on the frontier. So Thomas has just learned of the existence of Sarah, who is really rightfully the heir to the land that Thomas is squatting on, and therefore is a threat to his power as the elected empire as well, and is sending agents to kill her. So, what is this book? Is it alternate history? Well, yeah, there's a whole lot of alternate history in here. John Churchill and Oliver Cromwell and Isaac Newton play an important part of the backstory. Oliver Cromwell plays an important part in the story. He's the necromancer, and his act in unseating, dethroning the Stuarts, was to attempt to create an eternal republic. And John Churchill returned England, or rescued England from him by returning England to paganism in a great act of defensive magic. And Washington is part of the backstory. Benjamin Franklin looms significantly larger than Washington, actually, as the founder of the compact, but also as the founder and first head of a secret society called the Conventicle, which is still around and which is acting to sort of further the ends Franklin was worried about. So it's also in history. It is also epic fantasy. It is very much a quest story about a hobbit-like person, a small person from a small place, who undertakes an epic journey that will transform her and also the world. It's also very much a fairy tale. It's got where does Sarah come from? How is there this hidden child of the Empress no one knew about? Well, we learn, I'm giving away some spoilers here, but there's spoilers from early in book 1, so you shouldn't feel deterred. You're probably feeling deterred because I've been talking for like 20 minutes already.
No, I was just going to let you go.
Oh, good. Okay, so we learn that Curious Eleutherius was murdered. And that as he was dying on a sacred hill on the western borders of his land, with his dying blood, he anointed 3 acorns and sent them back to his wife. And she ate them and conceived from the 3 acorns and gave birth to 3 children in secret, who were each of them in their face, deformed is a strong word, but marked. Sarah is the first thing that's described in book 1 is Sarah's eye, which has never opened, which is swollen and is oozing pus. In fact, so here this is not criticism, but I have to make a comment. Dan Dos Santos, my cover artist, is amazing, and I'm sure that this is not only his fault, but also Tony Weisskopf's fault. But the one real problem with the covers of the books is that Sarah is always pictured on them, and she's always beautiful. And Sarah is not beautiful. Sarah is homely. Everyone who ever sees Sarah and has occasion to comment on it says she's homely. She's homely, but when she has a big swollen eye, she's homely when it comes out. And it turns out there's an acorn inside in the eye, right? She was born with this acorn, her father's blood in her eye, and then release of the acorn unlocks her magical powers. So the children are all born with something. One has an ear trapped to the side of his head, etc. So there's a kind of a fairy tale motif, right? And the sort of three hidden children, secret children of the king kind of stuff. So it's so look, book 3. Do I have book 3? No, I must have book 3. Here's book 3. Just Won the Dragon for alternate history, right?
Yeah, congratulations, by the way.
Thank you. And I guess all of that is a way of saying that it is not false that is alternate history, but also it is more. It is epic fantasy. It is fairy tale. It is romance. It is quest. As I first pitched it to Tony Weisskopf and Beth Meacham of Tor, it is Last of Mohicans meets Game of Thrones. And it's all those things.
Boom, wrap it up with a bow.
Yeah.
I do
Meacham to turn her back on me, by the way.
Because of the Last of the Mohicans bit?
She snorted and turned away and walked away. So I don't know which part offended her, but yes.
It's her loss. But I know that world building is not something that you just sit down and do all at once, right? I know it's sort of an agglomerative process, but do you always start with a map? Because I know that you've got a map for Palace, and I know that with the Cunningman books, you basically use the real map as it exists, because that one takes place a little bit more in our world than Sarah's story does.
Yeah, I 100% use that map. Yeah, so for Palace, I actually have this notebook here. What Moleskine, whatever, you get these all over the place. I literally, when was this? It was a few years ago, and I had kind of the basic idea for what I wanted to do. And I just said, okay, I'm going to start world building in this notebook. And the first thing I did was draw a map of a city, because I knew that what I wanted was a city, a setting with an old decadent kind of city at the heart. Although, and we may talk about this, but that again is very Earth adjacent. And then, 2 pages later, I said, the city better have some context. So this is some of the very first stuff I did. And by the way, there are now much nicer versions of this in that Brian McWhorter did for the book.
Mm-hmm.
But yeah, then I just started literally, I'd go through and I'd put I said, okay, every day I'm going to write 1 page and maybe onto the back side of the page. I'm just going to make up stuff about this setting. So I was like, oh, there's some strange races of man, and I just described them. There are some strange creatures, cults of Kish, recent historical events, and it's not systematic, except that I would read through and go, I haven't said anything about coins. Let me write out coins, right? And so I filled up about half of this notebook, but I did start with a map. And you're right, for the Cunningman, I had absolutely some real world maps. That happens, that and the sequel happened in some very real world geography and really specific places and canyons. Sometimes we deliberately tweak it. Hey, what if we put a canyon over on the backside here? Wouldn't that help? Yes, that would help the story.
Well, if it's convenient, right? Well, the reason I ask is I did the same thing, not so much with my science fiction, but with the fantasy stuff that nobody has seen that I've been working on for a long time. I won't try to dig it out, but I'll do that too. I'll what I usually do, because I'm not a geologist, is I'll take a piece of Earth and then I'll flip it over a couple axes and then zoom in funny and get the landforms down there, because no one will recognize I ran upside down and backwards. And sort of go from there and try to grow, cultures out of places. And I'll do, I guess, sort of the same thing that you're doing with the Witchy Eye setting in particular, where I'll try to build a culture that's like the culture that occupies that real geography, and maybe recognizable to people who know what I'm talking about. But my stuff's a little bit more removed. You're not gonna find Andrew Jackson's bones on display in New Orleans or anything. And so I find that starting with maps is a really interesting way to start. But people think that a lot of the more random details everyone expects then this is true, I think, of all writers who do this sort of world building, that if they turn over a rock and they find, some strange lizard that you just made up, that it was always there and that you didn't just put it there right before, right? Um, and so, but I'm always impressed with the breadth of the sort of random lizards that you've put in the world, right? I remember we did a talk on the Bane stream a couple months ago now, where we're talking about John Churchill, right, and the
Yeah.
paganism and where you got all this stuff from, and just because I think it's such a fun story. Can you talk about the he's a jolly good fellow stuff and
Oh
and
yeah. So
and
there's
and the pun, just to give people an idea of the sort of thing that goes into this.
uh
Yeah.
yeah, well, let me tell you two different kind of sort of yeah, that's two different things. Let me talk about both those. So first of all, the pun. So in the real world, John Churchill's father is named Winston Churchill, and if that sounds familiar to you, it's because he's like 13 generations the great great grandfather of the Winston Churchill we all know. And Winston is small gentry. And during the interregnum, while Cromwell is Lord Protector, those guys are out. So they're out kind of hiding and trying to keep together in the countryside, or fighting with the hashtag resistance. And it's a very different kind of resistance. And
Not the Star Wars one.
Star Wars. And then when Charles II comes in, right, they all want back into court. So they do things to ingratiate themselves to the new king. And Winston Churchill, the first, writes a book called Divi Britannici, Latin title. I'm pretty sure it's actually in English, but Latin title, and which means Divi, or illustrious men. So the title is something like Famous Britons. And it is a work on heraldry and genealogy. Okay, and of course, genealogy right up until yesterday was really a trade that was all about making up crap to flatter the people who were had the money to pay you, and convince them that they were descended from Charlemagne or Adam or whoever you wanted to connect them to.
Sure.
Nebuchadnezzar. So he writes this book. And this is his ticket back into court. That's the real world. So in the fake world, in the Witchy War setting, John Churchill's father writes a book called Dei Britannici, which means British gods. And I've written a story about this, actually. And it's called Dei Britannici, and it was published on the Bain website. And I think it's going to be in a collection of my stories I'm going to put out with a small publisher next year here.
Yeah, and it is free on Bain.com too. So if anyone wants to get into Dave's work for free, that'd be a great place to start.
It would be. And there are several free stories online.
Yeah, because that is a hell of a story too. I really like that one.
Oh, thank you. I had a good time with that. So, among other things, it's an homage to my good friend Ted. So, in the story, Churchill and his wizard Isaac Newton are basically in camp with their forces, and they receive news of a mysterious event, which is that Cromwell's men are going around stealing the baptismal rolls, the registries from all the parish churches in the towns from which Churchill's men come. And Newton deduces that what's going on is that Cromwell is preparing a magical attack against Churchill's forces, because by the laws which Newton himself has formulated, or in the real world, the anthropologist James George Fraser, right, things that have been in contact are always in contact, and things that are like each other are fundamentally connected. And so by the fact of baptizing these kids and writing their names down in the registry, you forge an intimate, permanent connection between that book and these boys. And then 20, 30, 40 years later, they're now soldiers. You can harm them by performing acts of black magic on the book. So Cromwell's going around stealing his baptismal registries, and this is what I was alluding to earlier. So Newton and Churchill, together with the parish priest Edward Grant. I had a really good friend named Ted Edward Grant, one of my very good English friends. So, and it's systematically excommunicates all these guys, and baptizes their horses in their names. So Cromwell casts his spell, and believes he has killed, 10,000 men. He has effected a massacre of horses and dogs and cats and camp mice, right? And then when his armies come in to clean up the remains, these guys all stand up because they're not dead in attack, right? So that's the basic story, and this is the pun is the Dei Britannici, British gods versus the Divi Britannici, British illustrious men. So that's the pun.
Right? I just think that's awesome.
Yeah. So I have Elvis jokes and Incredible Hulk jokes and Dukes of Hazzard jokes too. But also I have jokes that people should be like, there should be people who like are Egyptologists or read Hebrew who are like, wait a minute, I think you just made a pun. And the answer is, yeah, I probably did. So the other one. So, and this kind of connects to the point about world building, right? We were talking about, several points. One, sometimes you accidentally find the lizard that you want to put under the rock, right?
Right.
That's this story. And also, when I world build, to some extent, I'll write things that are objective facts in my setting, but I also really like to write stories and songs and riddles that people, or jokes that people in the setting will tell each other.
That fit like around the facts, right? Yeah.
And they might not agree, right? People have different songs, or this guy has a song and this guy knows a joke, and they imply different facts around some central episode.
Yeah, I love stuff like that because my series, the Sun Eater stuff, is all written as a guy's autobiography, and so I've started doing short stories from other points of view that contradict him, and they're from other points of view too. Some of them, so they're mutually contradictory, and that sort of thing is fun. I hope that readers like to dig through that kind of stuff and figure out what the truth is, because that's more fun than just listing out the events. In any sort of objective fictional way, right? So I love stuff like that.
Something else I believe, and I'm going to get back to this third thing here. I have not forgotten it, but something else I believe. I think you get the readers that you deserve. By which I mean, if you condescend to readers and really spell out in big letters what the emotion was and what the idea was and what the conclusion he made was, and then you get readers who want to be talked to like that. And because that's who's going to enjoy your books. When you write by hint and by innuendo and by inference and by pun, I think who comes back to read your book over and over again is people who enjoyed that experience.
Yeah, I think that's probably right. I think there's a certain element of like writing to market, even if you don't know what the market you're writing to is. There's to a certain degree, right? Obviously, you're not going to necessarily find a billion people if you don't know. You don't target them the way that, say, the indie crowd sometimes does, right? And they're like, I'm going to write specifically, men's harem adventure lit urban fantasy because that's what's in right now, right? Yeah. But if you just make your thing, even if you don't find a billion people, it seems to find the people it's for. Or at least, that may be my naive, imagining that's what happens. So I think I agree with you.
Yeah. There's another whole conversation to be had here around business, around the idea of brand, right? Around the idea that your persona and public behavior, and also the nature of your writing, the consistency of those things over time, will attract people who like you and who like the kind of books you're writing. So I think there is a market out there for everything, and the challenge is not all markets are equally big, and the challenge is finding that market. How do I find it?
Or equally localized? Yeah,
right.
Yeah, I think that's probably right.
So let me tell you the other piece here. So
Yeah, let's do that, and then let's maybe try and get a quick reading in.
maybe I'll do some reading. Or even I do a long reading. You can just check out. I'll just read here. Alexa can turn it off when we're done. So someone forwarded this song to me. I had not realized this. It might have been Chris DeBow, I think. Speaking of like, I mean, man, I've met just some amazing people who have just happened to read my books. Chris is one of them. I think he's the one who forwarded this to me. So John Churchill, in real life, did not defeat Oliver Cromwell, the necromancer. In real life, he defeated a greater foe, Louis XIV,
He stuffed the French. Yeah,
who wanted to be king of all of Europe, the Sun King. And he was an absolute monarch, and he had a very big army. And for 10 years, they fought. And John was the general of a motley group of a changing alliance that was very fickle. And he was, not only did he have to move his troops around and fight the individual battles against a succession of French generals, he had to politic the whole time to try and keep people in, and he had to like keep accounts, because the Dutch would be like, "You have not accounted for the potatoes. What happened to the potato?" You're like, "Damn it, the potatoes!" Right? So he was doing all these things, and 10 years he never lost. He never lost to the Sun King, so he became. This is his father was a minor nobleman, but John became the Duke of Marlborough for doing this, and got Blenheim Palace, which you can still go tour in the UK. So real life, very heroic, larger than life in various ways. And the French, of course, hated him. So one day, this rumor comes to France that John Churchill, the Duke of Marlborough, is dead. So this is late in his career, right? Because he's being called Marlborough now. And somebody promptly writes a song celebrating the death of Marlborough. They can't say Marlborough. I'm not doing a very good job either. So they say Malbrook. And so the song's called Malbrook s'en va en guerre, and it's a terrible song. Malbrook goes to war. Mirontena. Malbrook goes to war. He doesn't know when he'll be back. So the song doesn't really rhyme, especially, and it's got a little jingle in the middle, mirontena, which basically means like beef stew. So it's a terrible song, but it's got a very catchy. So what happens? So he leaves. His wife is walking around, missing him. She goes up to a tower. She sees a messenger. The messenger arrives. Have you seen Marlborough? Yes, he died. He's dead. Oh, I saw him buried. Are you sure? Yes, he is dead. Oh, we are all sad. That's the song. Okay, it's a terrible song, but it's a horrible earworm. So Goethe, 100 years later, in his diary, is traveling around Europe and writes that the whole damn continent is seeing various versions of the same song, because it's such a catchy jingle, right? And you have heard it too, because the melody survives today for He's a Jolly Good Fellow. Because the song goes, Malbrook s'en va en guerre, mirontena, Malbrook s'en va en guerre, ne sais qu'on reviendra. It's the words are terrible, but it's like the song that never ends. It's this little jingle that gets in your ear and it goes forever, right?
Yeah.
So when this was brought to my attention, I said I have to use this, and I include songs. I use in-world documents to world build. So I built a song out of this jingle, and the song appears in probably the song is the cause of my winning the Dragon Award, because it appears in book 3. When the new bishop of New Orleans, former and really current mobster, is fighting a war against the Chevalier of New Orleans. The secular and the clerical authorities are at war. The bishop wants revenge for his father's murder, and people start singing a song about him. Which is L'évêque s'en va en guerre. L'évêque s'en va en guerre. Mirontena. L'évêque s'en va en guerre. Ne sais où dormira. So it becomes a song around this kind of rebel bishop and his war. So and in the real, now there's a missing link which is implied by dialogue, which is in the Witchy War setting. There is also a song about Churchill, and it's not exactly the same lyric.
I love that stuff.
So yes, so that's on the fly. I did not sit down and like do that out in advance. I built that in as I discovered that song. So I'm going to put on my old man glasses, my cheaters, Aaron Michael Ritchie, my sometimes co-author likes to call them. So I'm reading. This is from chapter 1 of Witchy Kingdom. This is what I liked to read on tour with Christopher Ruocchio and Chris Husberg. It's a sequence I sometimes call the courtship of Thomas Penn. Thomas's great failure is that he's conscious that he's fighting these nieces and nephews of his for his power, and he has no heir. And so if he simply fails to reproduce, they'll probably end up with his land anyway. So this is him trying to get married. "You are not young," Temple Franklin said. The two men sat in Thomas's carriage outside an immense stone house, glittering with light. "I'm not old," Thomas shot back, "and if I'm old, you're older." "Yes," Temple agreed, "which is why I'm so very concerned about generating heirs. If I do not marry and have heirs before I die, my bastard nieces and nephews with whom I am at war will inherit my vast wealth and undo all my works. They will squander it on their strange Cahokian goddess rather than on feeding the poor and building highways in my name and in the name of my illustrious ancestor. My empire will not hold together, but will fall apart, to exist as separate little fiefs or be swallowed up by the new Spanish or cut to pieces by the free horse peoples. I have done so much in my life, and it must not be undone." "You bastard," Thomas said dryly. "How long is the list?" "7. 7 women who wish to meet the dashing Lord Thomas. That's one way to think of it. Or 7 fathers who hope to trade their daughters for family advancement. Cynic. It won't do to be idealistic or squeamish about this. Very few people are able to live the romance of a Hannah Penn in this world." Including Hannah at the end. Thomas remembered for a moment the bloodied, dying face of his sister and forced it from his mind. "I'm far from squeamish, Temple." "Good." Temple pushed open the carriage door and eased himself out onto the cobblestones between 2 waiting footmen. "Then let us go ravish some maidens." He must ignore the attractions of their persons, Thomas knew. Even the power of the ladies' families was only a secondary consideration, as were many kinds of wealth. Land, for instance, or illiquid shares in a joint stock company. What he needed was ready cash, and a steady source would be preferable to a large pile, though best of all would be both combined. Franklin stepped aside to wait as Thomas straightened his cravat and then rattled his Mars-sealed saber once in its scabbard for luck. Then the counselor followed Thomas through the wide front door. The building was the Philadelphia house of one of the great cattle-driving grandees of Ferdinandia in New Spain, His Excellency Felipe Albanés, Marqués de Miami. Cattle was a business that generally consumed as much cash as it generated, and in bad years more, which made the Marques's daughter Alejandra an unlikely candidate, even if she had been pretty. Unsightly Dago clabbernapper that she was, "Buenas tardes, Señor Thomas." Thomas leaped aside as the very lady he had been contemplating thrust herself into his view, and very nearly into his embrace. "Lady Alejandra, I have not seen you since your quinceañera, and you are even more lovely than I remembered." This was literally true, inasmuch as a thick plaster covered all 3 of the birthmarks Alejandra bore on her face. Nevertheless, they were striking enough for Thomas vividly to recall their locations, and the plaster did nothing to ameliorate a nose that resembled nothing so much as an oversized bobbin. "And you are so vital. On behalf of all the ladies of the Empire, I must beg you to reveal your secret, Lord Thomas. You do not appear half your age." Thomas tried not to furrow his brow. "And how old do I appear then, Doña Alejandra?" "Not more than 30, she cried, trilling an exuberant R that would have been the pride of Madrid. Not more than 30. Half his age. How old did she take him for? Focus. On the cash, Thomas reminded himself, there is no room here for your vanity. Felipe was powerful enough to be a fit ally and father-in-law, an elector as well as possessor of some sort of title under Napoleon's Spanish puppets. How much cash did he have? You are too kind, Thomas said. How fare the herds, my lady? Alejandra made a sour face that thrust her cylindrical nose downward. The market has been only ordinarily bad, of course, but this rampaging of the beast kind has interrupted the transport of beef to important markets. My father says they shall eat cheap beefsteak in Knoxville this spring and expensive pork in Chicago. Praise God, he always has more land he can sell. Praise God, Thomas agreed, with the biggest smile he could muster. Would that God granted your father a herd of pigs to match the size of his wealth in beef. He swung easily into a 90-degree pivot and a long step that would take him out of the Hidalga's clutches. Franklin swooped down on him and clung to his shoulder like a sorcerer's bat familiar. That was one, Temple said. How did you find her? She's cash poor, and she's too honest to hide it. What are you thinking? That there are only so many decent choices. You cannot quote one of your grandfather's tiresome sermons at me and say beggars can't be choosers. I'm not a beggar. I'm the emperor. Yes, but what you have asked for is a woman who is connected with both cash and electoral votes. More importantly, the cash. Still, that is a small field, and the winner may not be as impressive in her person as you could wish. Let us see the other horses, Temple, but no more ambushes, I beg you. No, I command you. There is a gazing pavilion in the garden behind the house. I shall conceal myself there. If asked, say I am contemplating difficult issues of state. Bring the ladies out one at a time to meet me. Do not send one until I have sent back her predecessor. I could have brought them to you at Horse Hall on such terms. Yes, but now the Marquess will be able to say that I attended his soiree, and others will remember having seen me. Besides, Venus is strong for me tonight, and what better place to capture the influence of Venus than at a ball? In answer to Temple's slight, disapproving cluck, he added, I'm wearing my town coat, Temple. This is hardly more dangerous than attending the theater. Thomas stood in the pavilion at the edge of a circle of light and heat and waited. When the woman began to come to him, he counted down. 6 was plain, but scholarly. Her cavalier father in Henricia, or as some called it, pining for England's last Stuart king, Carolina, had trained her in the classics and left her utterly without preference as to gods. She launched a rapid series of apothegms at Godar and bishops alike, in which Thomas joined with great amusement until she inadvertently reminded him that her father's vast fields were planted with tobacco, cotton, and maize. She lauded the fertility of the river-bottom soil, the size of the cotton bolls, and the natural juiciness of the tobacco leaves, but Thomas's answering smile was completely formal. No cash. 5 was an Ottawa princess. At least she was a princess in Thomas's imagination, and when she told him of her love of dancing and swimming, her light physique informed his imagination vividly. Her people's wealth was in furs, beaver hair, marten, and fisher. Thomas knew well that a shipload of New World furs brought to market in London or even in Philadelphia could make a man's fortune. He also knew that the business was risky, both on the supply side, which could be physically dangerous as well as subject to the vagaries of climate, and on the demand side, which was enslaved to the whims of fashion. His own Imperial Ohio Company was already driving down the price of furs with a huge volume of beaver pelts it was currently bringing to market. The best reason to marry 5 would be to induce her people to stop selling their furs. While that would help Thomas by driving up the price of company fur, it would impoverish the Ottawas. With visions of divorce and war against a confederation of cheated Algonquins, he set her back. 4 was a younger sister of the King of Oronbega. Her firstborn features were softened with an obvious strain of hardy blonde German, and she brought with her a queer 3-string guitar no longer than her forearm, flat and fretted diatonically. When she had finished singing a lilting ballad about the love of some queen who had died as her realm was flooded by the sea, she reminded Thomas of her land's wealth in coal and salt deposits, as well as its famously fertile soil. But it was no good. Thomas would have the wealth of Oronbega in any case by the relentless working of the pacification, and the shade of William Penn had insisted he show no mercy to the firstborn. Could Thomas hope for success in ruling his grandfather's empire if he began by traducing his grandfather's will? When Thomas shook his head and invited her to go back into the house, the firstborn princess boldly pressed her body against his and lifted her lips in the most elemental of pleas for grace. But Thomas was fixed of purpose. He was gentle as he steered the young woman back toward the ball. 3 was an Igbo woman from Birmingham. She disavowed she had any connection with the Lord Mayor there, who was the elector, although that was a vote that was often cast by proxy. While lovely, she was the oldest of the 7 and also the calmest. She smiled, recited a lengthy poem in Igbo when asked, and talked about how much she missed the weather on the Gulf Coast. When Thomas grew tired of equivocation and directly asked her about her family's wealth, she would only admit to owning a fishing boat. By this time, Thomas had grown short-tempered. Very well, then, he snapped. Enjoy the remainder of the ball. She smiled as she left. At the door, Thomas met Temple Franklin. What were you thinking? He demanded. She says she doesn't even know the elector. You said cash was more important. The spectacles quivering on the tip of Franklin's nose made him look as if he were about to fall under the force of Thomas's irritation. What cash? Thomas snorted. The woman owns a boat. A boat? Ha ha, Temple guffawed. That's what she said to you? Thomas waited for Temple's rolling belly laugh to end. That woman, Franklin finally explained, is John Hancock's sole trading partner in Birmingham. She's a smuggler? A very wealthy one, who either didn't want to admit it or isn't interested in an alliance with me. Temple arched his eyebrows. Shall I bring her back? No, Thomas said quickly. I was impolite, and she is uninterested. Bringing her back will only compound the offense by making me look stupid as well. Bring out the next lady. Thomas instantly knew Tu was Acadian from her growled R's and pure vowel sounds. She was a cousin of Lafayette, and her father was a banker. She claimed a talent for language and without further provocation launched into a monologue that would have been at home among the workmen of Babel, shifting language every 3 sentences as she recounted her travels to London, Paris, and elsewhere with her father. Thomas followed her through English, French, and German with satisfaction and then endured 5 minutes of gibberish that nearly left him unconscious. He had finally convinced himself that he could tolerate this woman as a wife, especially if she would agree to stay in Quebec most of the year, when she concluded her oration on the delighted note that her father would be so pleased to see her make an alliance with the Penns, especially with the capitalization problems his banks had been having in the last few years. Thomas wished her and her father good luck, concealing the white knuckles of his clenched fists behind his back. He recognized the last woman with a shock, although he could not remember her name. She was the oldest daughter of Kimoni Machogu, Prince of Shreveport. She had her father's fierce stare and the curve of his lip that hinted at his piratical ancestry. Thomas listened to her genealogical recitation along with a surprisingly detailed inventory of facts about the cotton wealth of Shreveport and several songs. Finally, he wrapped both her hands in his and looked into her eyes. Please tell your mother and your father that I am trying very hard to marry a wealthy woman so that I can bring as much help as I can to Shreveport as quickly as possible. Are you going back home? The girl's hands trembled as she shook her head. No, I am staying here with my sisters. Good, Thomas said. For now, that's wise. Temple Franklin found him a few minutes later, leaning his forehead against the cool trunk of a magnolia tree and sinking his nails slowly into its bark. I take it none of them was a match, Temple said. You do so many things so well, Thomas said slowly. It turns out that finding a suitable bride for me is not one of them. Did you try the Lord of Potosi? He's so wealthy, he's not interested in you. What about the silver miners in Georgia? Ben Yehuda said he'd be willing to talk. How do you feel about wearing a little round cap and giving up pork? I suppose I'd be willing to wear a cap. I rather think it's the other requirement that is non-negotiable. Next, he'll be wanting to discuss circumcision. Thomas sighed. Well, then, Temple, I think our course of action is obvious. He straightened, stretching the muscles of his back and looking up into the night sky for guidance. Obscured by winter clouds and the lights of Philadelphia, the stars gave him nothing. His burdens felt, if anything, heavier. I haven't yet consulted with the Anakim, Temple pointed out. The wealthiest of them will be the ones with the largest pile of lake fish and otter's bones, Thomas said, not a help. However interesting it might be to make love to an 8-foot-tall, red-headed woman with hands like coal scuttles and a bed perched atop a pole. No, our solution is rather nearer to hand in New Amsterdam. You have someone in mind? Thomas nodded. It's time to settle a lawsuit.